All right. Good afternoon. Let's continue today where we left off yesterday in our chapter 23 of the Salvo book. Let me share the screen here so you see what I'm seeing. And we'll go to PowerPoints here. And we were talking a bit about how there are cells in the nervous system, central nervous system, and peripheral nervous system. And these cells include neurons and their neuroglia. And in the central nervous system, we have four neuroglia in astrocytes, which essentially act as a blood-brain barrier, feeding the neurons nutrients from the blood, but yet preventing neurons from being exposed to some of the other potential caustic things in the blood that could affect neuron production or neuron function, excuse me. So that's those are astrocytes. We saw there were microglial cells, which are small, bushy cells that do a good job protecting the neurons from pathogens and debris, and they keep the area clean. They prune synapses in our younger years so that we make room for plenty more synapses over the course of our life. We saw oligodendroglia or oligodendrocytes, which were designed to myelinate the axons of the neurons of the central nervous system. And then there's the lining cells of the ventricles of the brain and spinal cord that act as reservoirs for cerebral spinal fluid. Those cells that line the ventricles, they're ciliated, but they're able to help feed the neurons. They're called ependyma. Some people say ependyma, but ependyma. And so the ependymocytes or ependymal cells, they're part of that entourage of cells that act as neuroglia for the central nervous system. We also saw the Schwann cells and the satellite cells, in brief, anyway, as far as peripheral neurons go. And Schwann cells myelinate the neurons of the periphery, and satellite cells act as ion and gas moderators of the neuron cell bodies. So we also looked at the neuron itself and saw that there were sensory neurons and motor neurons. And the sensory neurons, if you remember, they look a little different than the motor neurons. The motor neurons had those big dendrites all around their cell body, a large cell body, nucleus in the middle, and then an axon that went toward a cell away from the central nervous system. So it went toward the muscles or toward the joints or toward the glands or toward the organs, but going away from the central nervous system. Those were motor neurons, also called efferent neurons. And they're the typical classic neurons that we identify parts from. But when we saw the sensory neuron, we saw that its receptors, whether in the skin or in the muscles or in the joint, would have a long, if you will, process from the receptors toward the cell body, but instead of going into the cell body, it has a tendency to bypass the cell body with a relatively short axon into the spinal cord of the brainstem, where it will junction with an interneuron. The interneuron itself is not myelinated. It's not covered by any Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes, and so there is a little slower movement, but they're relatively short in length. So the amount of time that there's an impulse across the interneuron is still relatively short. What the interneuron is, the associative neuron, it is a neuron that is positioned between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron while still relaying through the sensory neurons toward the brain, such that if there's enough intensity of incoming signaling from the receptors of that area of the body, the motor neuron can be fired in response to that incoming sensation by the interneuron, even before it's gone up to the brain, been processed, analyzed, and then the brain making a decision as far as what to do about that sensation. The interneuron pretty much took care of it by activating the motor neuron so that there's a motor response or a movement away from that sensation, because the simple way of saying it is time is of the essence. Speed is important for self-preservation. So the faster that you respond to a potential threatening stimulation, a stimulus that is too much pain, too much touch, too much tickle, too much temperature, something that's just too intense that could potentially be injuring or damaging. Well, we want to respond to it, move away from it faster. And so that's where the interneurons can be very important. It's something that we define as what's called a reflex arc. So as the sensory impulse comes in, it reaches the interneuron. The interneuron would relay it up the sensory neurons toward the brain. But when it comes in with a lot of intensity, not only is it getting relayed up to the brain, the interneuron fires the motor neuron, which goes right back to where it came from, but to the muscles, and you move, whether it's putting your hand down on a hot stove, stepping on something sharp, an initial tickle or whatever that you're not expecting, there should be some type of reflex or a response, if you will, that the interneurons essentially created. So if you remember, sensory neurons are afferent. That means that something affected the body, it was picked up by the body, and it's sent directionally toward the brain, because all neurons are categorized by the direction of their impulses. If they're going toward the brain, they are sensory or afferent impulses. If they're going away from the brain, they're motor or efferent impulses. So here is a picture of the reflex arc. Okay, I'll go back to it in just a moment. Whenever we're talking about reflex, reflex is the simplest form of nerve activity. It's involuntary. It happens without any higher center processing. It is simply sensory and motor response to it, regardless of processing. Sensation comes in and there's a motor response. A jellyfish, for example, it survives off of reflex. Something touches a tentacle, that sensation comes in, it causes the other tentacles to go to it, to grab it. It doesn't know what it's coming into contact with. It can't analyze it. It's not got the intelligence figured out. But if it happens to be something that the jellyfish can eat, well, then it will survive a little bit longer because it just got food. If it happens to be a swimmer's leg, well, it's going to sting that swimmer, but it's not going to get to be food for the jellyfish. And if it happens to be a rubber tire that it comes into contact with, I guess I'm thinking polluted oceans, guess what? That jellyfish, it's going to come in contact with that tire, but it can't do anything with it. But it's still going to, and still the reflex makes its activity bring those other tentacles toward it, just in case it is food. So it starts with the whole reflex anyway, starts with what's called a receptor, which is at the very, very end of a nerve, embedded into the skin, embedded into muscle, embedded into tendon, embedded into the joint capsule, wherever the receptor is, it's near the periphery, and it's stimulated somehow. And so then it becomes an electrical signal that transmits or conducts across the sensory neuron directionally toward the brainstem or the spinal cord, depending on where the sensation is. For example, if it's related to my head, face, or neck, it may go into my brainstem. If it's somewhere else in my body lower than my head, face, or neck, it's going into the spinal cord. In the spinal cord is that interneuron. That's what's called an associative neuron. The previous slide said association neuron, but I've seen it as associative, not association. Regardless, it's an in-between. It's a go-between. And that's what inter as a prefix means. It means between. So you've got the afferent neuron impulse directionally traveling toward the spinal cord or brainstem. It comes into contact with the interneuron. The interneuron typically just acts as a relay up to more sensory neurons on the way to the brain through what are now called tracts of the spinal cord. T-R-A-C-T, tract. So there are many tracts on the spinal cord, and for the most part, the backside tracts, the dorsal columns, they're referred to as the dorsal columns because they're on the backside, which is what dorsal means, and they have a column-like shape. They're full of sensory tracts traveling up the back of the spinal cord, heading toward the brain. And they're going to make a pit stop as these neurons end up bringing the impulses into a part of the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus is essentially a kind of like a call center. Like if you were making a telephone call back in the 1950s, you would get the operator, and then the operator would actually connect you. The thalamus somewhat acts like that for your brain. As the sensory impulses come up through the tracts of the spinal cord, they go into the thalamus, where there are different what are called nuclei of the thalamus that essentially is able to receive that information and prioritize its importance, if you will, to where in the smartest part of the brain that information needs to go to, so that your brain can process it properly and accurately, and it can make decisions. So if information comes into the thalamus with a greater intensity in certain tracks, it's going to get a lot more priority going to your intelligent brain than some of the more everyday mundane sensations that are constantly being received by your body and sent up to the brain. So this allows the brain a way to essentially itemize and prioritize the sensations that are coming into it. The interneuron is the relay between the sensory neuron and the brain. But when the information flow from the sensory neuron is coming in with such great intensity because something stimulated that receptor with a lot of, well, a lot of potential threat, we'll say it that way. And just to let you know, it's not really just a single receptor. It's however many receptors are in that part of the body that pick up that stimulation. If enough of it with a great intensity that suggests harm to the body comes into that spinal cord, that interneuron, as it relays information up to your smart brain with priority that allows it to, allows you to be aware of it, has already sent a motor response through the motor signal to make the muscles pull away from that receptor area that came into contact with the world. All right. So it's referred to as the reflex arc because it's sensory in and motor right back out. So it's got an arc, or, arc, arch, same word, coming in, going out. So let me show it to you this way. All right. So here's this pin that pokes the finger. And the information flow of all that pain and that sharpness comes in through the receptors of the fingers. Okay. I'll use my laser pointer here. So the pin pokes the finger, lots and lots of intensity of sharp pain, right? Picked up by these receptors and these nerve endings. And then it becomes an electrical impulse that gets conducted through the nerve of the finger in through the nerve of the forearm. All right. I don't know why it's showing that cell body right there. It really should show that much, much closer to the spinal cord. But that's supposed to be the cell body of the sensory neuron. The axon bypasses it. It's myelinated. It gets into the spinal cord where there's a synapse, a connection between the sensory neuron and the interneuron. If this intensity comes in with enough, if you will, over stimulation or over activity, not just a little minor sensation, but just a real sharp, just intense sensation. Not only will there be many sensory neurons that are picking it up, but the cell bodies add to it, and it comes into the spinal cord with such great, really, just great impulse conduction that the motor neuron gets activated as it's connected to the other side of the interneuron. And then the impulse goes down the motor neuron and goes to the muscle of the finger, the extensor muscles of the finger that straighten the finger and pull it away from that sharp pin. All right. Now, if we were to do this accurately, let me get my pen on here. As the impulse is traveling this way, because it's a sensory impulse, right, traveling toward the spinal cord, it's a sensory or afferent impulse conduction through the sensory neuron, which, by the way, will be on the backside of the nerve. As it comes into the spinal cord, this still relays up the spinal cord to the brain, but at the same time, because it's such intense signaling coming in, it also fires that motor neuron back out. So by the time the brain gets wind of what's going on and says, ow, that hurts, go ahead and respond, it's now adding to it. You've already pulled away. Now, what the brain does thereafter is have you continue to pull away, or maybe start rubbing your finger, or, all the good things you do after you poke your finger with a pin like that. So you become aware right in this part of, I'll show you exactly where I become aware of it. Let me get my eraser. When the signal comes in and goes up the spinal cord, it will eventually affect, if this is the right hand, we've got to go to the left side of the brain because it'll cross over. But you see where this part is right here, over here? I'm going to do a little spot. That's where the right hand, or sorry, that's where the left hand. Yeah. Oh, that's a right hand. Okay, I'm right. That's a right hand. So this is the left side of the brain. So that's where it would be. It would be almost exactly right there, somewhere in that part of your brain on this, what's called postcentral gyrus. You would feel that your brain becomes aware of that sharp pain. Then there's a lot of communication that happens between the brain, a lot of this forward directional stuff where you start cussing and yelling and saying ouch and getting mad at who left that pin there, right? All that front brain's doing that, getting angry and upset with the person responsible for that pin, while this part of your brain is still going, ow, that hurts. This part of the brain will also decide if it's going to start rubbing the finger with the other hand, if it's going to make a fist, pull away, whatever, right? Because that's the way the communication flow works. It all started with nerve endings in the finger. The impulse traveled toward the spinal cord. Again, if there wasn't enough intensity, or if let's say you were doing it on purpose and you were aware that it was getting ready to happen, it would just relay up to the brain. But when it's reflex and it becomes involuntary, it immediately fires the motor neuron. You're going to pull away well before the brain says, hey, pull away. Let's see what the chat says. In case anyone was curious, the postcentral gyrus is a cerebral fold in the parietal lobe of the brain that contains the primary somatosensory cortex. It is located on the lateral surface of the lobe between the central sulcus and the postcentral sulcus, and it extends forward and downward from the upper edge of the cerebral hemisphere. Huh. All that is true, and fortunately, we're going to get a chance to see it. Yes, we are. But that is where you feel your body parts, on the postcentral gyrus. And the hand part of it is almost right on the top. All right. So this is the reflex arc. The brain is not part of the reflex as far as when you feel it to when you move. What the brain does is it actually stops the reflex and then takes over what you're going to do with the effector side. All right. So if the brain can't, for whatever reason, if for whatever reason the brain is unable to stop the reflex, the absolute moment this pin hits this finger, the person's going to pull away and they're going to get stuck pulling away. Okay. Going to get stuck that way, or it might bounce a little bit. It's something that we call clonus. C-L-O-N-U-S, clonus. It is the continuation of the reflex because the central nervous system is unable to stop the reflex from happening. Now, because signal intensity lessens, the clonus doesn't stay that way forever for the rest of your life. It's sustained, and then within a few seconds, it starts to let down. There is a type of clonus that we call transient, where it's almost like the central nervous system is trying to stop it, but it looks more like there's a bouncing effect. So after somebody's had a stroke, which is a type of brain injury where blood loss, for whatever reason, causes injury or death to the brain tissue, we might see clonus, brain traumas with physical brain trauma impact with the brain, certain types of infections that cause damage to the brain. Any of these can lead to the potential for seeing clonus in reflex. I had a patient many years ago. She was involved in a very, very bad car accident. She was in her mid-60s. She was in a Volvo. She was at a red light, and a utility truck, I don't know if it had ladders on it or what, but it was a full utility truck going about 50 miles per hour in a 40-mile-per-hour zone, never hit his brakes or anything, and just slammed into the back of her. Little old lady ended up, her glasses ended up in the back of the car. The Volvo was accordion, and as far as the damage, and she was taken to the emergency room, spent a few days in the hospital, but they pretty much just let her go because they didn't see much on the x-rays. And a week later, she came in to see me in a lot of pain, could barely move. So I was intrigued by the car accident, and as I was doing my exam and my workup with her, I noticed that, especially with her legs, if I took the ankle and dorsiflexed the ankle quickly, it would cause a transient clonus. So once I saw that, I did a full neurological evaluation and assessment, and she had all kinds of issues going on with reflexes, especially lower extremity reflexes, what we call myotones, which are muscle grading, where she had a considerable amount of weakness where she shouldn't have had weakness. So I sent her to a neurologist. The neurologist did his full workup, sent her in for an MRI. The MRI showed a number of lesions on her brain. Well, when neurologists see that, their first thought is, wow, these are lots of lesions, which are types of anomalies that you see on the imaging. And so his thought was, we better test her for multiple sclerosis, because that kind of imaging, when it comes back with that number of lesions, suggests multiple sclerosis. Of course, all other laboratory work was negative for multiple sclerosis. So it was determined that what she had was a bunch of bleeding on her brain from little tiny tears in the blood vessels from such massive impact force, causing her skull, to go one way, or brain to go another, and it sheared the blood vessels, causing a lot of small little breaks. So essentially, she had a whole bunch of tiny little mini strokes as a result of that motor vehicle accident. And it took her a long time to recover as far as pain. Never really got over the issues with the neurological stuff. And then I want to say it was about 8 months after the car accident, she had gone into her husband was military, so she went to the Scott Air Force Base Hospital for a type of infusion. In her younger life, she had a blood transplant and was positive for hepatitis C. So she had some kind of blood or some kind of infusion or blood transfusion or something for her hepatitis C at the base hospital, but the procedure didn't go the way they expected it to, and they had to rush her over to St. Louis University Hospital on the St. Louis side of the river. The hospital there blamed her issues on the infusion, but what happened is because of how the hospital had, at the base hospital anyway, because of how they, I guess, did the infusion or transfusion, whatever it was, an area of her brain that was demonstrating still some of those strokes, it became a massive stroke, and she never recovered from that massive stroke and passed away a few days later. So it's hard to say if she would have ever had a stroke like that had she never had those shearing injuries. But if I wouldn't have seen those evidence of the clonus when doing the neurological assessment on my part, she may never even gone to see a neurologist to find out that she'd had all that bleeding on her brain. So the end of the story is that a few years later, her husband and his attorney called up and had me do a deposition where they wanted to know if there was a potential relationship between her motor vehicle accident and the massive stroke she had versus the hepatitis C work that they did in the hospital. And my notes and the neurologist notes suggested that the stroke was definitely the result of the car accident, but I don't know how it ever turned out. So hopefully he was correct in that, and her children hopefully had got a little bit of money from her as far as toward their education and things of that sort. So anyway, that's ultimately, again, evaluating the reflex arc. For her, it was a quick dorsiflexion, which was too much stretch. That stretch came in from her heel into her spinal cord. The motor neuron fired the plantar flexors of gastrocnemius and soleus to contract, while the brain would get information. The brain said, that's not too much stretch, stop. But it couldn't really stop it because, again, the parts of the brain that needed to stop it had been injured from that stroke that she'd had. So, reflex arc. Notice it says arch up here, but arc on the previous page. They're the same word, okay? Again, it's the simplest form of nerve activity. There's no higher center processing with the arc. It's just sensory in, motor back out in response to the sensation. All right, as I mentioned, the brain and the spinal cord, they don't have nerves. They have a bunch of bundled tracts of nerve fiber, but it's not isolated as far as, you know, completely encased in its own connective tissue. They are bundled into a greater spinal cord or part of the brain, whether it's the cerebrum and its cortex or the cerebrum and into its core or the cerebellum. The tracts are bundles of these neurons. But when you look outside into the periphery, they end up becoming these nerve wires. And the nerve itself is not only bundles of different tracts, but it's got a connective tissue blanket that holds it all together, different connective tissue blankets for the bundles, and each and every neuron is actually surrounded by its own connective tissue blanket. So those of you that already had the first semester, we had this discussion with the muscle fibers, where, you know, each and every muscle fiber essentially is wrapped in its own connective tissue blanket. So what I do when I'm sitting at this desk anyway is I take these pens, right? Okay. So if this is a neuron and this is a neuron and this is a neuron and this is a neuron, each and every neuron has a blanket wrapped around it. Just that one neuron has a connective tissue covering called an endoneurium. That endoneurium will insulate this neuron from the one that would be next to it, okay? So that the electrical impulses that are traveling down one neuron don't affect the other neuron. So they each have their own endoneurium. And if you take a third neuron and a fourth neuron and a fifth neuron, and let's say that I take a connective tissue blanket and I wrap them, okay? You can see all those neurons, but they're encased in this connective tissue blanket. Well, if I took one of these, another one of these, another one of these, right? And let's say I just took 10 of them and I took an even bigger blanket and wrapped it all together, that would be a whole nerve. This would be one bundle in the nerve. This would be one neuron in the nerve. And then whatever blanket is around it, I'll just put a blanket around it, okay? All right, let me show you how I've got a connective tissue blanket. Look, it's surrounding that neuron. Now, there's the neuron. Here's the connective tissue blanket, okay? So imagine if each and every one of these pens had one of these cloths around it, and then the whole of the bundle has this cloth around it, and then the whole of the nerve has an even bigger blanket. This is a much easier thing to demonstrate as far as analogy inside the classroom, especially when I have a number of people sitting at desks. Because what I do is I have everybody in the room. Let's say I've got 20 people in the room. I'll just say, all right, you five, you are neurons. Your skin is your neuron cell membrane, but you're wearing clothes. Your clothes are your endoneurium. And then I'll take 5 of them, or if I have 20, and those 5, I'll say, imagine I have you guys wrapped all in a single blanket. And then you 5, you're wrapped in a blanket. You 5, you're wrapped in a blanket. You 5, you're wrapped in a blanket. So I have 4 groups of 5, each wrapped in their own blanket. And then I'm going to take one big, massive blanket, and I'm going to wrap all 4 groups together. That is a nerve. So the big blanket that wraps all the bundles is called the epineurin, which means upon the nerve connective tissue. It wraps the entire nerve. It is basically to the nerve what the epimysium was to muscle, wrapping the muscle. It'll be the same thing when we get to the heart and we say epicardium. It'll wrap the whole of the heart. It's just where the connective tissue is. So the root word is always built in. Neurium is nerve connective tissue. Mysium is muscle connective tissue. Cardium is heart connective tissue. Ostium will be bone connective tissue. And then the prefix just tells us where is that connective tissue. Is it inside the whole thing around each and every neuron, which is what endoneurium is? Is it around the bundle, which is what peri means, surrounding, like perimeter? And by the way, fasciculi, don't let that scare you. In English, it's fascicle. It translates loosely to little bundle surrounded. Okay, so one neuron surrounded by an endoneurium, a bundle of neurons surrounded by perineurium. All of the bundles, all of the fasciculi, all of the fascicles wrapped in one thing, that is the nerve. Here's a picture. All right, so here's a neuron. This right here is its endoneurium. Endoneurium. See all these neurons, and there's probably what, 40 little neurons in there, maybe more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Probably about 30. Okay, close to 30 anyway. Each and every one of those is a neuron. And look, there's the axon, which again is its tail. There's the Schwann cell, or because these are peripheral neurons, or peripheral nerves, excuse me. So it's got to be a Schwann cell. And then it's all wrapped in its own endoneurium. Endoneurium there, endoneurium there. All of that little purple stuff is endoneurium. But it's wrapped in a blanket called the perineurium, and that's this blue stuff. And hey, just to let you know, there's blood vessels inside of a nerve. Blood vessels that surround each fascicle. Fat inside of a nerve, which makes it look yellow, by the way. Well, the fat acts as insulation. The blood vessels make sure the neurons get what they need from the blood. So by definition, this is a nerve, yeah, but it's not a single tissue. This is an organ by definition, because the definition of an organ is it's made up of multiple tissue types, and there's nerve tissue here, there's connective tissue here, right? So that makes it an organ just because it's got more than one nerve or tissue type. And look, here's a bundle. That's called a fascicle. Here's a bundle. That's called a fascicle. Here's a bundle. That's called a fascicle. So this particular nerve has 4 fascicles in it, wrapped in a big old blanket. And that is the epineurium. And what's really cool is, let's just say, for example, I'm going to put my pen on. Let's say that this is the line that separates it, and this is the front of the nerve. Okay, the front side of the nerve, and this is the back side of the nerve. Let's just say it, just for the purpose of demonstration. I don't know if it's the front or the back or not. The front ones would have motor tracks going away from the central nervous system, away from the brain, and these back tracks would have they'd be the ones going up the back, sensory-wise, as far as tracks toward the brain. Because for the most part, the backside of the nerve, the backside of the spinal cord and the backside of the brain is sensory. Afferent information traveling up from the nerve into the spinal cord, up the spinal cord, up the brainstem, into the backside of the brain for processing. And the front side of the brain, down the front side of the spinal cord, out the front side of the nerve, that is motor or efferent going away to the body. That is a nerve. It is peripheral. The tracts of the central nervous system, and I can show you that. Let's see if I have a picture anywhere. I'm just going through it real quick. Okay. So this is a picture of the spinal cord that we'll get to, not today, but another day. And if you notice, there's this brown part right here that's all unmyelinated interneurons. And then there's all this white stuff. Those are axons of the different tracts that are myelinated. And notice that the back of the nerve where the lump is, where the sensory neuron is, that's sensory coming into the back of the spinal cord to go up these dorsal columns up to the brain. But when the brain sends it back down, it comes out the front of the spinal cord, out the front of the nerve to the rest of the body. So the tracts here, there are tracts that are in here, in here, in here, in here, right? These are different tracts of the spinal cord. And they're somewhat shaped like the spinal cord themselves, right? These little tracts. And they've got different names, and we don't really need to go into all the anatomy of the tracts of the spinal cord. It's really not that necessary. But some of the tracts are named for their thickness or their wedge shape or their thinness or the fact that they're lateral or the fact that there's it kind of looks like a gem, like a ruby. So again, that's too much anatomy that will never come back to haunt you. So it's not really something that we're going to explore. But once you're outside of the nerve and you're in the spinal cord of the brain, then you're talking tracts, TRACTS, sensory and motor tracts. The sensory tracts are on the back, the motor tracts are in the front. All right. Now, one of the more, I guess, challenging, is that a right, is challenging the right word? Do I want to use the word challenging? I don't know if I do want to use the word challenging. Let's try it this way. One of the more, I guess, academic sides of teaching the nervous system is getting into the discussion of the nerve impulse and how the nerve impulse happens. And the reason I say academic, again, I'm trying to stay away from challenging, is because there's a lot of chemistry speak to what's going on, a lot of discussion of ions called sodium and potassium and ion gates of the cell membrane and the nature of diffusion and millivoltage that's created by the flux of influx, outflux of sodium and potassium. And because of that, I found that when we discuss the action potential, the nerve impulse as it's conducted, there's a lot of wide eyes or confused looks, and I don't really want that to be the case. I don't want you to think I have to know every single step of how a nerve impulse is conducted, how it's initiated and conducted and propagated. I mean, I wish I could say, imagine a bright light that gets brighter, and all of a sudden you see that little bright light travel down the axon. That is a nerve impulse. That is the impulse being conducted. And if that's all you ever remember, great. You now know what nerve impulses look like. But what's really going on is a little bit of chemistry, a little bit of exchange of ions where it creates a static charge, and that static charge, because of the electrical activity of these ions and the way the cell membrane is built, it ends up getting to a threshold, and then all of a sudden it's moving down the line. So when you watched the videos yesterday, and I showed you that one where the impulse looked like it was jumping and going so much faster than that slow non-myelinated neuron, that was an impulse. And so if you dive into the chemistry world of discussing it, and you are, let's say you are well-versed in chemistry, and you know all kinds of things about sodium and potassium and chloride, and you're familiar with milliamperage and voltage and all that good stuff on the physics side, hey, maybe you look at this and go, that is such an easy discussion. Well, whether you find this easy or not, I'm going to show you what a nerve impulse is. I'm going to show you how the impulse travels down the axon, especially myelinated axons. And I'll use words like, this is the polarized state. This is the depolarized state. It has to repolarize. There's a small window of refractory period where that axon cannot be used because it's not reset yet. But if none of that registers, as long as you can still in your mind visualize that electrical light just traveling down the axon, I don't care if it's going toward the brain or away from the brain, as long as you can visualize that, that is the nerve impulse. That is referred to as the action potential or the nerve impulse that's being conducted in a leaping-like fashion down the myelinated axons of neurons. So it all starts with a stimulation, whether it's a receptor that's picking up in the periphery, or whether it's a motor neuron in the brain. It initiates this initial impulse, this initial electrical current, and now it has to travel. And so the way that the neurons are built is the cell membrane becomes more and more riddled with types of receptors that are, well, protein gates, if you will, and they can change their shape to where they can close so that nothing come in, or they can open like a channel. And then if there's more of something on one side of the cell than on the other, it goes directionally that way. So if you think about your cells are mostly water, and they're not too terribly salty as far as sodium goes. But a lot of the wastes, the fluids outside and around the cells, that's a bit dirtier, and there's a greater amount of sodium, or if you will, salt, in the outer cell water than in the inner cell water. So when one of those channels opens up, all that sodium-rich outside stuff is going to flood in toward the lesser sodium side of the inner part of the cell. Well, the cell actually has a greater amount of potassium relative to sodium, and there's not so much potassium on the outside, so some potassium goes out. And if it was a nice even exchange of sodium and potassium, this would not even be close to a discussion. It would just be an exchange of sodium and potassium. But because the sodium comes in so great and potassium just leaks out a little, the positivity, because sodium ions are positively charged, they've got an extra proton, and they're loving to just bind to stuff to neutralize that positivity. So sodium ions, these positively charged ions relative to potassium ions, which are also positively charged, by the way, as sodium floods in and potassium just trickles out, that little area where the flooding of the exchange, all that positivity comes inside, leaving the membrane on the outside a bit more negative. And if you know anything about electricity, electricity is based on electrons, which are negatively charged. So because the membrane of the cell becomes more negatively charged in that zone, it gets staticky. Okay, not much different than the static when you're, I don't know if you've ever been in the dark and you rub your feet on the carpet and then you touch your nose or something, or you touch something, you can actually see a little zap. Same type of electricity, okay? That negative influx of sodium, well, the positive influx of sodium causing the membrane on the outside to be a little bit more negative, creates a static charge. Well, the cell membrane works to try to correct that. So as it works to correct that, it essentially allows that membrane to become a little bit more negatively charged, and it starts to pump out the sodium and pull in the potassium. But the way it's built is that it can only pump out 3 ions to every 2 ions, 3 sodium ions to every 2 potassium ions. And so it creates this imbalance, if you will. Well, as that's happening and the static charge is there, just down past that static charge, another gate is starting to open to let sodium come in. So the static charge moves into that place. And again, behind it, it's trying to restabilize. So then that static charge, it just keeps on moving down the line as sodium gates open. And then the cell is trying to pump the sodium back out. All right. And if this happened just nice and uniformly, right, along just a simple like gate after gate after gate, we would just watch the static impulse create and then just move down the line as sodium just trickles and trickles and trickles, and then it's replacing behind it. Okay, it's you'll see what I mean. I'll actually show you a video of this, and it makes a little more sense. But it's the reason why the impulse can only go one way, because behind it, it's working to get back to where it was before the static started on the membrane. I'm calling it static because it's electrical, all right? And so it can only go one direction. If you didn't have that same thing, it would come in and you'd actually find it go in both directions, and this wouldn't work at all. There would be no impulse conduction. It's the reason, though, why neurons can only send signals one direction, either toward the brain sensory or away from the brain motor. But with that said, when those ion channels open and sodium and potassium flood in, that is what is creating this ultimate static charge, the change of sodium and potassium. And by the way, a lot of the sodium is in this it'll come out and it'll bind to chlorine and this and that, and the sodium does all kinds of stuff. But as far as the electrical potential of the nerve, it's this almost incredible flooding of sodium. And again, when the membrane has to try to pump the sodium back out, it can only pull in 2 potassium ions to every 3 that it's pumping out. And again, it creates a bit of an imbalance. So it slows the ability of that neuron to just immediately be able to open up sodium channels again. Once it's reset, that charge, that impulse is already further down the line, and now it's ready to go again. And as soon as those sodium channels start to open, first they just trickle, and then all of a sudden the gates open and sodium floods in again, and now you've got a new static charge, a new impulse. All right, so because this is a regular event and it's going on over and over and over again, you can describe the neuron, whether it's in its resting state, which means it's polarized with a lot of sodium outside and potassium inside, so more positivity outside than there is positivity inside. Then the sudden depolarization, where that negative and positive switch, so now it's more negative on the outside, more positive on the inside. And then the repolarizing, which again is the cell membrane trying to get back to where it was. And so those are the words. Polarized, just to let you know why it's called polarized, or why we say anything's polar, it means it's on opposite ends. Okay, so the North Pole and the South Pole, right? The 2 ends of the globe. When we talk about water, we say that water is it's got polarity to it because it's got 2 hydrogen and an oxygen, and where the 2 hydrogens are, it keeps that part of the molecule positive, and the oxygen, its part of the molecule, is negative. So you got a positive on one side and a negative on the other. So we call that polarized. The cell membrane is polarized, meaning that there's positivity on one side of the membrane and negativity on the other side. But when that switches, it's called depolarization. And as it works to repolarize, again, there's this brief period in time called the refractory period, where it cannot generate another action potential. Once it's fully repolarized, now the refractory period is over. You can use that neuron again to transmit another impulse. So that was my explanation. And the explanation sometimes makes a little more sense with visual. So the resting state of the neuron is positive on the outside where all the sodium is, negative on the inside where there's less sodium. Once the sodium gates open, sodium's going to eventually, from a trickle, flood in to the cell. So then in order to get the sodium out, it has to be pumped out. And so that gets it back from the resting state once it's polarized and then depolarized. So it is polarized when it's resting, then it depolarizes. As it repolarizes, it's because of sodium potassium pump. Okay. With that said, you never have just a little bit of it going on. When it happens, it happens. It's all or none. Okay. The sodium rushes in. It starts out with a little trickle, but as soon as when the gates open, you're going to get an impulse every single time, all or none. So repolarizing again, the neuron's trying to get back to that resting state. It's repolarizing because it had depolarized briefly. And again, the refractory period is that short time where you just can't use the neuron until it's fully restated back to the polarized position. All right, so here's what I'm talking about. Here is the motor neuron. Here are the dendrites. There's the nucleus. There's the cell body. Here is the axon and its terminal end bulbs. this little zone of the cell membrane of the axon, it should be positive on the outside and negative on the inside. But when you see that little impulse, that's because there was an influx of sodium causing it to be a little bit more negative at that part of the membrane. So again, Na is sodium, Na plus. Now we see the positivity inside, the negativity outside. This is that static charge along the membrane. Now, it can't go backwards. It can only go forward, which means as these gates then open and these positive sodiums rush in, this negativity will rush out, this will jump to that zone, and then that zone, and that zone. And that's why we see it moving down the line. So as in an effort to get that sodium out, the neuron has to pump it out, all right? And as it pumps it out, it's able to get the potassium back in, the sodium goes back out, but again, it's an unequal ratio. It's a 3-to-2 ratio, which is only really important in understanding why there's so much difference in negativity and positivity as far as the cell goes. All right, so again, I wouldn't worry too much about it. It has to do ultimately with both sodium and potassium, but notice that the static charge is here initially, then here, because it's moving down the line of the axon. And again, if this is unmyelinated like the interneuron, it's a steady, continuous action potential. If it's myelinated, it's going to go from gap to gap to gap, those nodes between the myelin sheaths, and it's going to jump, boom, 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 or leap down the axon, making it incredibly fast. The non-myelinated axon, it's a traveling of about 1 to 3 miles per hour. But the myelinated axon is almost 300 miles per hour in speed. Again, top speed of 277 miles per hour, but trust me, it is a considerable difference traveling leap, 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 leap down myelin than it is the steady impulse of the action potential down the cell membrane. Now, the reason why I keep saying action potential is because the nerve impulse will ultimately release chemicals that continue often as another electrical impulse along muscle membrane that may make the muscle contract. So it's referred to as the action potential rather than the impulse once it's on a muscle. Same story as far as the sodium potassium, just a different membrane from a different cell type. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the world of still pictures, and I'm going to show you this action potential, this nerve conduction on an actual neuron. Okay. I had looked up something I wanted to see yesterday. I said something about neurotransmitters. This is for the next part of the lecture when we talk about neurotransmitters. But yesterday I couldn't remember if it was 30 or 300. I had one of those two in my head, and so I decided to look up neurotransmitters. They're roughly 27 common neurotransmitters. Scientists have found over 100, and they expect that there are more that we're just not aware of, according to this article. So a little later, I'll read you this. This is from Cleveland Clinic, and I thought it was a really good explanation of neurotransmitters. So we'll come back to that. Right now, I want to go to some video of the nerve impulse. Let's put this up here. All right, so we're going to do neuron. No, that's not how you spell neuron. Neuron conduction. It's an impulse conduction. That's 18 minutes. It's a lot longer than I want. This is a little explanation of it, and it's I believe it's okay. If I remember right, this one might be the one though where actually I think if I remember right, it's not bad as far as animation, but the accent's real hard to understand because it's actually done in India, and I think that there might be a little bit of other stuff in there. So this one we'll do first, okay? This is the nerve impulse, and eventually I'm going to take you to a really good one that's going to show you all that stuff happening on these channels, okay? So let's start here.
A nerve impulse is an electrical current that travels along dendrites or axons due to ions moving through voltage-gated channels in the neuron's plasma membrane. Voltage-gated channels open and close in response to an electrical voltage, so they are affected by changes in electrical charge around them. When a neuron is at rest, a charge difference is maintained between the inside and outside of the cell. This charge difference is produced and maintained largely by active transport using sodium-potassium pumps. The pumps send sodium ions out of the cell and bring potassium ions in. While other channels allow some flow of potassium ions back out of the cell, the sodium ions cannot easily get back in to replace the lost positive charges. The overall result is that the exterior of the cell has a net positive charge and the interior has a net negative charge. The difference in charge between the interior and exterior of the cell is called the resting membrane potential. A nerve impulse begins when a stimulus disturbs the plasma membrane on a dendrite, causing sodium channels to open. Sodium ions flow into the cell, lessening the charge difference at that location. If the change is enough, it will cause nearby voltage-gated sodium channels to open. This allows so many sodium ions to flood into the cell at that location that the membrane there is depolarized, with the local region inside the cell having a net positive charge and the outside of the cell having a net negative charge. This affects neighboring voltage-gated sodium channels, which then open, moving the depolarization along the membrane. This moving depolarization is called an action potential. Changes occur behind the action potential to restore the resting membrane potential. The voltage-gated sodium channels close and voltage-gated potassium channels open. This allows a rapid flow of potassium ions out of the cell, repolarizing the membrane so that the inside is again negative and the outside positive. This is followed by use of sodium-potassium pumps to fully restore the resting membrane potential and to reestablish proper concentrations of sodium and potassium ions inside and outside of the cell.
All right, so that was one of them. Let's see, I think it's this one. Yeah, this one's not bad. Do I like this one better though? That's a good question. They're both really pretty much the same. This one's newer. I'm almost positive this synapse animation is newer, but I think it more focused on the synapse rather than the 3D of it. Let's see if I'm right. Let's see. Yeah, that's the synapse. Okay, so then we'll do this one.
Your child needs these 3 key factors to get into an Ivy League or top 25 university.
How does the pain you experience when you burn your hand result so quickly in an action by your muscles? Many animals respond to environmental stimuli using specialized cells called neurons. A stimulus is detected by sensory receptors, and the body responds through motor effectors. These cells working together allow you to respond very quickly to threats. When you touch something hot, heat receptors of a sensory neuron detect the stimuli and send the information of heat to an interneuron in your central nervous system. From there, a motor neuron sends a response from your central nervous system to the skeletal muscles in your arm, causing them to contract and pull your hand away. The fundamental process of neural transmission that underlies this action occurs in all neurons of the body. Neurons transmit this information through changes in the electrical potential of the membrane by the movement of ions across the membrane. An electrochemical gradient governs the movement of these ions, resulting in an electrical impulse. The resting membrane potential in a neuron, when the cell is not firing an impulse, is established by the unequal distribution of sodium ions outside of the cell and potassium ions inside the cell, making the outside of the cell more positively charged compared to the inside. The electrochemical gradient is established and maintained by an enzyme called sodium-potassium ATPase. When a neuron is stimulated, sodium ion channels open and sodium ions flow into the cell. This leads to a change in the electrical potential across the membrane called depolarization. The depolarizing electrical potential travels down the dendrites and over the cell body. Multiple electrical potentials will combine at the axon hillock in a process called summation. If the depolarization is large enough, an action potential is triggered. Action potentials are all or none electrical impulses that maintain their amplitude and strength down the length of the axon. The action potential travels down the axon when the depolarization of an area of membrane causes adjacent voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open. The influx of sodium ions results in membrane depolarization along the membrane. After a short delay, potassium ion channels open and potassium ions flow out, repolarizing the membrane. For the neuron to fire again, the resting membrane potential needs to be re-established. Sodium-potassium ATPase is used to move sodium and potassium ions against their concentration gradients, re-establishing the resting membrane potential. As the action potential moves down the axon, ions are diffusing only a short distance, allowing the signal to move quickly. At the axon terminal, the electrical impulse passes to another cell at a cellular connection called a synapse. The space between the presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic cell is called the synaptic cleft. The presynaptic neuron contains signal molecules called neurotransmitters that are packaged inside vesicles. When an action potential reaches the end of a neuron, neurotransmitters are released by exocytosis from the neuron into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitters bind to the adjacent cell at receptor sites attached to ion channels. The channels open, allowing the movement of ions into or out of the effector cell, which alters its membrane potential, thereby transmitting the signal from the neuron to the effector cell. Because nerve impulses move very rapidly down the axon of a neuron and move from cell to cell across synapses, you react quickly to a stimulus, like burning your finger.
Are you having trouble trying to...
All right, so there's one more that I want to show you. It shows the sodium and potassium in a slightly different way. It looks like that one right there, but it wasn't it. And she's very good at explaining it, I think, anyway. Neurotransmission, that's pretty cool looking for 38 seconds anyway. I wonder why I'm not seeing it. Let's change the setting here to action potential of neurons. Okay, let's see if I get it to come up that way. Neuron action potential, they're drawing, a lot of people are drawing it. This is it. Okay, so again, she's going to show you the action potential and even myelin, the way it wraps around, but when she shows the concentrated ion channels and the way she shows the sodium gates just trick and then open up, sodium will be green and Na as it floods in, potassium will be blue and K plus as it goes out, okay? So this is a real good, I think it's a really good video anyway.
The Schwann cell contains the typical cell organelles and cell membrane structure. However, notice as the Schwann cell surrounds...
Okay. So it's going to show the Schwann cells and what Schwann cells are for the peripheral neurons and the action potential, which is the impulse. And again, when she compares the two, the one that's not myelinated to the one that's myelinated, watch how fast it leaps from node to node. All right, here we go.
What you will see and hear in this presentation is the development of myelin in the peripheral nervous system and the propagation of the action potential along a myelinated axon. This multimedia presentation will be most helpful if you already have a good understanding of the Schwann cell and the electrochemical process of the neuron, called the action potential. The Schwann cell forms a protective covering around the axon. Schwann cells start to develop in the embryo and continue to increase the wrapping around the axon through childhood. This development increases the thickness of the wrappings, which peaks in adolescence. This is why teenagers have such quick responses. The Schwann cell contains the typical cell organelles and cell membrane structure. However, notice as the Schwann cell surrounds the axon that the nucleus and other organelles are squeezed to the outside wrapping of the cell. This outer wrapping of the Schwann cell is called the neurolemma. The inner lining is made up of layers upon layers of cell membrane. This inner wrapping is called the myelin sheath. You will recall that the cell membrane, called the fluid mosaic model, is made up of a bilayer of lipids integrated with proteins. The thicker the myelin, in other words, the more layers of cell membrane making up the myelin, the more advantageous it is to the axon. One advantage is the regeneration of severed axons. Another advantage is an increase in the speed of the propagation of the action potential along the axon. The rest of this presentation will concentrate on the increased speed of action potentials down the length of the myelinated axon. Here is the neuron, and you can see the repeated Schwann cell membrane forming the myelin. Note that there is a small space between the Schwann cells where the axon is not covered by the neuroglial cell. These spaces are called nodes of Ranvier. From what you already know, action potentials occur at the axon hillock and continue to be repeated away from the cell body, much like dominoes falling one after another. An action potential starts on a polarized membrane, which is -70. A stimulus causes the sodium gates to open slightly, and sodium starts to trickle into the cell. If the cell reaches -60 or threshold, the sodium gates open wide and sodium floods in, bringing the inside of the axon to +30. At this point, the sodium gates close and potassium gates open. Potassium starts to pour out of the cell. This allows the neuron to become polarized again. Then the sodium-potassium pump starts to actively transport sodium out and potassium back into the neuron. First, we will look at the propagation of the action potential in the unmyelinated axon. Propagation is the repeating of action potentials down the axon. The action potential is repeated because as the sodium comes in, it diffuses to adjacent areas within the axon. As the sodium increases in this area, threshold is reached. Sodium gates open wide, sodium rushes in, causing depolarization and an action potential. As the sodium enters this area, it diffuses through the axoplasm and another action potential is created. This continues down the length of the axon. Now look at the myelinated axon. The same process applies to the myelinated axon. An action potential develops, and as the sodium comes in, it diffuses through the cytoplasm of the axon. It continues to diffuse through the portion of the axon wrapped in myelin. The increased sodium concentration reaches the node of Ranvier, increases the axoplasm to -60, and depolarization occurs. The sodium gates open wide, sodium floods in, and we have an action potential. Again, the sodiums diffuse through the axoplasm, reaching the next node. An action potential develops. The process is continued down the myelinated axon, passing from node to node. Compare the unmyelinated axon with the myelinated axon. You can see that action potential reached the end of the myelinated axon more rapidly than the unmyelinated axon. The speed of the propagation is faster going from node to node than action potentials that develop adjacent to the previous action potential.
So basically what she's saying is that if it's myelinated, the signal is going to jump because all of those channels are clustered in the nodes. So because the more enwrapped that part of the axon is, the less any diffusion of any sodium can happen right there. So the sodium can only diffuse at the next node and then the next node and the next node. So that's why it appears to be leaping. So because there's fewer gaps with the nodes, well, boom, 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 all the way down the line, 277 miles per hour versus just continuously going down the tail at 1 to 3 miles per hour. So that's the nature of where myelin is just really great to have. Myelin, this is a node. If you look on there, node. So it's going to jump and get there rather than if all that myelin was off, it would just go and slowly work its way down. So very, very effective to have myelin. And we will see in a pathology discussion that there are conditions that we call demyelinating conditions, where the loss of neuron, the loss of having myelinated neurons really changes the way the brain and spinal cord can function. So when we get into our pathology discussions and we start talking about Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, ALS, which is called Lou Gehrig's disease, even some really just debilitating, painful pathologies. One is called Huntington's disease. I don't really talk much about Huntington's disease, but it's an incredibly painful, debilitating neurological condition, and it is absolutely demyelination, and it totally affects the way the nervous system is expected to function, and just a horrible pathology to have to suffer from as far as Huntington's. Even ALS, there's no cure for ALS, there's no cure for Huntington's. Currently, there's no cure for Alzheimer's, maybe some ways to slow Alzheimer's progression, but no cure. So one day, perhaps all of these neurological conditions will be eradicated, and that may happen as a result of science figuring out how to repair neurons or maintain full myelination, or gap the bridge of injured neurons in the spinal cord, say, regenerate brain cells. I'm curious what this is. It's one of those shorts, and I'm watching a non-myelinated and a myelinated neuron spin around. So I'm going to hit play just because I want to see it. Okay, that was short. It's just showing the speed at which the impulse is. This one's traveling real fast, that one's slow. That's all it was. All right. So what is the synapse? Well, that's an example of a synapse. Look at the two neuron parts coming together and all those chemicals being released. I think that's what's on slate for the next discussion. Let's see if I'm right. Because I have to be right, because that's why I have the neurotransmitters. Let's see. Okay, synapse. Essentially, the synapse is the junction of the neuron to whatever the next cell is. Could be another neuron, could be a muscle cell, could be glandular cells, could be anything that the nerve needs to connect to. So the junction of the nerve, the neuron, I should say, to whatever it's going to innervate, whatever it's going to connect to, that is what we call the synapse. If you remember yesterday's video, the one that had that claymation, okay, the one that was more claymation-like, she mentioned that there are two types of synapses that we see in nature, and one of them is called an electrical synapse, which is basically like the physical joining of two parts, where the electrical conduction can just keep on going without any pause. And then there's the more complex electrical synapse. The electrical synapse is the one that uses neurotransmitters. And the idea is that if you have an electrical synapse where they come together and they physically bind, the impulse is just going to continue through it. and there's not really a lot of ability to change, at least change quickly, the receiving cell's information flow. Because when you physically bind it, it just continues to propagate that type of conduction. But when it's electrical and it's not capable of changing quickly, it means that there may not be the ability to respond to the environment as effectively. Introduced through evolution, the ability to make those connections more chemical. Now, based upon which chemicals are being introduced, you can make for a quick change to the nature of the communication. Let me say that a little bit more basically. If I'm sending a signal and I want something done, I want to excite your activity. I want to make sure that if you becoming more active from my instruction allows us to respond, then I'm going to excite you by sending what are called excitatory signals, releasing chemicals that are going to excite your chemistry so that you're going to become very active. Now, if what I need done requires you not to be working, then I can change that by introducing inhibitory signal information that's going to stop you from being so chemically active, and that will hopefully get us the response we want to the environment. The only other types of signals are just what we would refer to as modulating signals, which means I'm going to just tweak here and there, just little bits of changes, tiny little changes for the better. We want to just tweak the chemistry, not change it completely. So there's this discussion of what's called feedback. And that is the brain monitoring feedback, essentially trying to balance homeostasis. And a signal is sent out, something is carried out, the brain is either happy or not happy with it, and you get this going over and over again. So let's say that the brain wants to say balanced, but there's too much of something, and the brain decides it wants to slow it down. Maybe the choice of slowing it down is to excite some parts of the body, inhibit other parts of the body, and in turn, it should it should see in its monitoring that the body does balance out. Again, when you're responding to the environment, sometimes those quick changes disrupt the rest of homeostasis. So not only is the nervous system there for maintaining homeostasis, but the endocrine system's there for maintaining homeostasis. The endocrine system's more of a body-wide. We're going to just send it all out there like it's mass communication, whereas the nervous system is direct line of communication, fast signaling. Let's get this done. Let's get back to balance. It's self-preserve. Now, with all that said, on occasion, all you want is just slight little tweaks to what's going on to be happy in the environment. At other times, I need to change things. I need to get something more active. I need to inhibit something, whatever it is, to respond accurately to the environment. Okay. Now, with that, the synapse, because of the ability to release chemicals that can be excitatory or inhibitory or modulatory, it makes for faster changes in response to the signaling of the environment. And again, neurotransmitters are the chemicals of communication. Hormones are also chemicals of communication, and many neurotransmitters are also called hormones. But it's where these chemicals are found that title them as neurotransmitters or title them as hormones. If you find them in the blood, if you find them being produced from glands directly pumped through tubes directly to the site where that chemical instruction should be, we call those hormones. If it's in the bloodstream, they're endocrine hormones. If they're out of the bloodstream and pumped through tubes directly to their target, they're called exocrine hormones. Those same chemicals, if in the nerve synapse, it's called a neurotransmitter. And again, yesterday I thought I couldn't remember, it was 3,300. It was one of those numbers was in my head. The reason 30 is because you'll often see there are close to 30 because there are 27 common neurotransmitters, of which about 12 of them are the ones you hear about all the time. The most common neurotransmitter in the brain is called glutamate. one of the most important neurotransmitters, especially for muscle contraction and brain health and just glandular function, is acetylcholine. There's dopamine, there's adrenaline or norepinephrine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, which are also created by the adrenal glands, right? So those categorized as catecholamines. They are excitatory. Serotonin is inhibitory. Gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA as it's abbreviated, it's modulatory. So there are different chemicals to encourage different activities of cell. If you're going to become a pharmacist, if you decide that massage school is a stepping stone toward pharmacy, you're going to learn the ins and outs of every single one of those. But as far as massage therapy, when you're working with clients that have neurological conditions like Alzheimer's, which is pretty common, Parkinson's, which is the second most common neurological issue. Parkinson's is a deficiency of dopamine, a type of neurotransmitter that affects the brain. But there's a version where it's actually a deficiency of acetylcholine, excuse me, and that is myasthenia gravis. And people that suffer from myasthenia gravis are really not, it's not easy to live with myasthenia gravis. It's also not easy to live as dopamine becomes more and more deficient with Parkinson's. It's very challenging because it disrupts the typical neurological flow of information between the brain and the body, whether it's myasthenia gravis, whether it's Parkinson's. And so as a therapist working with clients that suffer from this condition, if you're aware that their condition is the result of the deficiency of dopamine, Parkinson's, or the deficiency of acetylcholine in, again, myasthenia gravis, or Alzheimer's, low levels of acetylcholine with Alzheimer's. So in knowing about those conditions and working with your clients, you may be hearing and thinking about those neurotransmitters and how your massage technique might be improving, the quality of the tissue so that there's better nerve communication between the brain and the body. That's just an example. And I don't know if as a therapist you're thinking that, you're probably focusing on more of the signs and symptoms of their condition and helping them to navigate their day better, helping to reduce pain and tension, improve range of motion. Those are the more structural or physical aspects of how massage therapy is approached. But to an underlying degree, if a therapist is a little bit more versed on how those neurotransmitters affect the person and understand why those signs and symptoms are there because of the deficiency, then perhaps that therapist can put together a little bit more specific, unique treatment protocol for that client with that Parkinson's or that myasthenia gravis. And these are just examples. That's probably where you hear the neurotransmitters. As far as regular everyday activity, we just don't really pay much attention to neurotransmitters. I mean, they're absolutely vital to the communication process, but I can't remember the last time I was working with a patient in my chiropractic office and thought, well, I hope this improves the neurotransmitter model of the synapse. That's not how, I don't think at that level. But if we dove into the microscopic world of a connection between a neuron and another neuron, or a neuron and a muscle, or a neuron and a cell of any type, we would see that where the synapse is, where that bulb comes and joins, there's going to be a bit of an indentation. All right. So again, I'll use this cloth as the membrane. Okay. Let me make sure I'm pointing this at the camera so you can see it well. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do this. Okay, so if my finger represents a nerve end bulb, a terminal bulb, it doesn't punch through the membrane, but it creates a bit of an indentation so that there's a bit of a crease in the membrane, and then the bulb will sit within that, and there's a gap. It's called the synaptic cleft. And that is the point at which neurotransmitters will flood, or not, flooding sounds a little bit extreme, but they will leave the bulb of the neuron, and they will diffuse into that space, which is a fluid-filled space, and then that enriched fluid of neurotransmitter, as it diffuses, some of those chemicals bind to the receptors, and the receptors that are built to bind to those chemicals, as they become activated, it changes the chemistry of what's going on to the receiving cell. So, as far as every little step-by-step process of what happens in a synapse, when the end of the nerve gets the electrical signal, it causes calcium to diffuse into the bulb. That calcium then pushes, it creates an effect to where the vesicles full of neurotransmitter will fuse to the cell membrane. And when that happens, all of the material inside the vesicle diffuses into the space of the gap. Okay, in the space, the gap between neuron and receiving cell. This is where neurotransmitters are able to bind to the receptors on the receiving cell. After a little bit, since less of the vesicles are being put into the space with neurotransmitter, some of that neurotransmitter actually dissociates, which means it just kind of fades away. Some of it is reabsorbed back into the neuron, the initial neuron, and back into the vesicles. It's the reuptake is what that's called. And the rest of it is cleaned out by enzymes that come in and break down the neurotransmitter so that it can't bind anymore to the receptors. Once that happens, the space is clear of that neurotransmitter until the next time the neurotransmitters are released into that space. This allows other neurotransmitters to be released into the gap, or a changing of from the excitatory mode, right? So that the chemistry just calms down. Or you can continue to just dump neurotransmitter and keeping excitatory or keeping inhibitory, whatever you need to do. The brain just uses that nerve pathway as a means by which those chemical instructions to the neurotransmitter will encourage the receiving cell to do what the brain wants it to do. So words sometimes, again, don't do justice to this discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the nerve bulb here. Okay, so this is the end of the neuron. If you look, let's zoom in. Nope. That's the one right there. If we zoom in, we see here's one neuron, here's its end bulb, here is the dendrite that it's connecting to, forming a synapse. So if we move this over, here is the terminal bulb, the end bulb, the synaptic bulb, all the same thing. It's a bulb because it's got to have enough space for all these little blisters of material in there called vesicles. A vesicle, by definition, is a little fluid-filled sac. Before scientists even knew that they were fluid-filled, under a microscope, they look like air bubbles. So they initially called them vacuoles, which means, well, it's Latin for little bubble, right? Little air bubble. They thought they were air bubbles, but they realized after however many scientists come by or however many generations of teaching that these are not air-filled bubbles, they're fluid-filled bubbles. And they're actually carried the length of the axon. They're made in the cell body by all the proteins of the cell body, all the instructions from the nucleus. They're made in these vesicles, and there are tiny little tubes, bundles and bundles of tiny little tubes that run the length of the axon. They're called microtubules. The vesicles have to get from the cell body to the bulb, and they're delivered to the bulb by little tiny what are called motor proteins. Motor proteins will bind one end to the vesicle and the other end to the microtubule, and it looks like the motor protein is walking down the microtubule, just walking down the microtubule, and it will take it all the way to the end where the vesicles collect in this bulb. Once they collect, they're ready to go. Now, some are different sizes, some are different filled with different chemicals in there. Some have acetylcholine, some have dopamine, some have serotonin, some have substance P, some whatever or glutamate if this is in the brain, whatever the vesicle is full of. And then when the impulse gets here to the end, that action potential encourages calcium to diffuse into the cell membrane. When that happens, the motor proteins respond to it and pull these vesicles right to the membrane, where if you look at this vesicle, that vesicle, they're fusing. The vesicle is made of the same material as the cell membrane. So when the two come into contact with each other, they just fuse. They become part. It's almost like the vesicle melts into the membrane, and all of those chemicals that are inside of the vesicle spill out into the space. These are the neurotransmitter molecules. They're diffusing into the fluids between the synaptic bulb and the receiving neuron. These little orange things right here are called receptors. Receptors, for all intents and purposes, are locks. Neurotransmitters, they are keys. If the key fits the lock, it will have an effect on the receiving cell. If the key doesn't fit the lock, that key will not bind to that receptor. It won't do anything. So the other receptors that are on this membrane that would respond to a different type of neurotransmitter won't be able to bind to these molecules. So if that molecule that those other receptors is released, they'll bind to those receptors, and that's going to be a different chemical interaction with this receiving neuron than these. So the way to think of these receptors is they are the gatekeepers to the instruction of chemistry that's going to then occur inside the next cell. Activate one set of gatekeepers, you get this chemical interaction. Activate another one, you get that chemical interaction. And so as long as that's the case, and there's over 100, according to the article I'm going to show you in just a moment, of neurotransmitters, over 100 neurotransmitters, of which, again, 27 are common, and really 12 of the 27 are very, very common. So let's just say that there's 12 common neurotransmitters. We would expect to see different receptors for each of those neurotransmitters. Some might be able to combine, as a receptor, bind to 2 or 3 of those neurotransmitters. Others may be only one of those neurotransmitters. It just depends on the type of receptor. And for the most part, what a receptor is, not much different than the proteins you saw with the sodium and potassium. They're proteins, maybe with some sugars or something else, that are built a certain way to bind to the molecules of neurotransmitter. Okay? So again, a chemical lock receiving a chemical key. If the key fits the lock, it opens it up. If the key doesn't fit the lock, guess what? Nothing's going to happen. So after these vesicles dump their neurotransmitter into the space, diffusion takes place. It's going to evenly distribute. Some will bind to receptors, others will dissolve away. The rest is either going to be taken back into the cell membrane and put back into vesicles that are hanging out. It's called reuptake. Or some enzymes move in, and an enzyme is just a catalyst of chemistry. It's going to basically make something else happen. So this catalyst of chemistry is going to come in, and there's going to be chemistry that occurs in the space rather than inside the next cell. Enzymes break things down. That's the easiest way to talk about these chemicals. They're good at breaking things down. So that means that this molecule that would be a key to fit this lock, if the enzyme comes in, let's say that this green thing's acetylcholine, then an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, you hear that erase part, acetylcholinesterase, it's going to come in. The ASE ending of chemicals is enzymes. It'll bind to this. It looks like it almost attaches to it, like it eats it, and it essentially breaks it down so it can no longer be a key that fits these locks. And then whatever's recyclable gets recycled. Whatever becomes waste eventually gets removed from the body as waste. So that's part of the whole process. This is what it looks like at the microscopic level of where a synaptic bulb forms a synapse and a cleft, a gap between the receiving cells. Now, again, me just explaining this sometimes doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So how about, instead of me trying to use words, we go back to our video so that we can see what happens inside a synapse as neurotransmitters release. But before we do that, I want to show you that article of what neurotransmitters are that I found from the Cleveland Clinic. I am tired of this thing popping up. I need to figure that out. Okay, so here's the article from the from Cleveland Clinic, and I believe this is yeah, I think there's more than one Cleveland Clinic as far as location, but this is their website. So neurotransmitters are your body's chemical messengers. They carry messages from one nerve cell across the space to the next nerve, muscle, or gland cell. These messages help you move your limbs, feel sensations, keep your heart beating, and take in and respond to all information your body receives from other internal parts of your body and your environment. So what are neurotransmitters? They're chemical messengers that your body, let's just see. So when you say reuptake in this context, is this the reuptake that, yes, similar, but that's specific. So SSRIs are used when you're, that's for your heart, right? Yeah, so those are reuptake inhibitors, right? And so that's designed to minimize, to prevent the reuptake, so that, depression, anxiety, that's right. So that those neurotransmitters, as far as the back into the vesicles, they could just dissolve in the selective way. Yeah. So it's specific to the reuptake of serotonin then, right? So it's going to inhibit that recycling of serotonin. Yep. SSRIs, that's right. Yeah, same concept. All right. So yeah, and we'll see serotonin as one of these neurotransmitters here. So neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that your body can't function without. Their job is to carry chemical signals or messages from one neuron to the next target cell. The next target cell can be another nerve cell, another neuron. It can be a muscle cell, it could be a cell of a gland, whatever it's going to connect to. Your body has a vast network of nerves that send and receive electrical signals from nerve cells and their target cells all over your body. Your nervous system controls everything from your mind to your muscles, as well as organ functions. In other words, nerves are involved in everything you do, think, and feel. Your nerve cells, your neurons, they send and receive information from all body sources. This constant feedback is essential to your body's optimal function. So the nervous system controls functions like heartbeat and blood pressure, breathing, muscle movements, thoughts, memory, learning, and feelings, sleep, healing, aging, stress response, hormone regulation, digestion, sense of hunger and thirst, sensations like what we hear, feel, see, touch, taste. You have billions of nerve cells in your body. It's 300 billion, in fact. A cell body, as we saw yesterday, is what produces the neurotransmitters, maintaining the function of the nerve cell. The axon, again, the long axis of it, the long tail, carries electrical signals along the nerve cell, the neuron, to the axon terminal. Terminal means end, right? If when someone or something is terminal, they're going to meet their end. So axon terminal, the terminal of the airport or the train station, it's the end point. I mean, you could argue it's the beginning point also, but it's on the exit that it's called a terminal. This is where electrical messages are changed to chemical signaling using neurotransmitters, communicate with the next group of neurons or muscle cells or organs. Neurotransmitters are located in the neuron's axon terminal, as we saw. They're stored within these thin-walled sacs called synaptic vesicles. Each vesicle can contain thousands of neurotransmitter molecules, okay? Thousands of molecules of, that type of neurotransmitter, or in some case, multiple neurotransmitters within the same vesicle. As a message or signal travels along a neuron, the electrical charge of the signal causes the vesicles of neurotransmitters to fuse with the nerve cell membrane at the very edge of the cell. So that's what we saw at the end. It's a fancy biological term called exocytosis, because cytosis, which means cell condition, exo means the outside. So it's what's allowing the stuff to get outside the cell, exocytosis. The fusion is called pinocytosis. The elimination of the material is called exocytosis. With that said, The neurotransmitters now, which now carry the message, are then released from the axon terminal into a fluid-filled space called the synaptic cleft of the neuron and its target cell, whatever it's connected to at the synapse. In this space, it's called the synaptic junction. The neurotransmitters carry the message across less than 40 nanometers wide. By comparison, the width of a human hair is about 75,000 nanometers. So the gap is only 40 nanometers. Each type of neurotransmitter lands on and binds to a specific receptor on the target cell. And there it is, like a key that can only fit and work in its particular lock. It's partner lock. After binding, the neurotransmitter then triggers a change or action in the target cell, like an electrical signal in another nerve cell or another neuron, a muscle contraction, or maybe it causes release of hormones from the glandular cell into the blood to be part of that endocrine system. So what action or change do neurotransmitters transmit to the target cell? And this is where they can either be excitatory in nature, inhibitory in nature, or modulatory in nature, as I mentioned before. Simply put, excitatory excites the neuron, causes it to fire off its message, meaning that the message continues to be passed along the next cell, and it's encouraging more activity, more activity, more activity. Let's do this. Examples of excitatory neurotransmitters include the glutamate, epinephrine, norepinephrine, whereas inhibitory neurotransmitters block or prevent chemical messages from being passed along. So the gamma aminobutyric acid, the GABA, can be inhibitory, and glycine, serotonin, they're inhibitory, whereas modulatory neurotransmitters influence the effect of other chemical messengers by, again, just slightly adjusting or tweaking, whether it's a slight inhibition or a slight excitation. And I know that a lot of the GABA is also considered modulatory. So that's the nature of how this is all happening. What happens to neurotransmitters after they deliver the message? After neurotransmitters deliver their message, the molecules must be cleared from the synaptic cleft. It's the easiest way to make room for the next set of instruction, right? Clear it out, either by diffusing away, being reabsorbed, the reuse of it, right? The reuptake. And again, those SSRIs inhibit or prevent that reuptake so that you don't have it ready to go again. It's got to take longer to get those vesicles made and down there. So that's how that medication's used in that process. Or perhaps those enzymes, like I said, those esterases, the cholinesterases, whatever the enzyme, again, suffix ends ASE, it's enzymes break things down, and degradation is a great term for that. Okay, breaks it down. How many different types of neurotransmitters are, and this is where again, yesterday, for whatever reason, I had 30 to 300 in my head. In fact, my wife, she mentioned to me that, we really only talk about 15 or so, a dozen or so common types of neurotransmitters. And I go, well, I'll look it up then. And so here you go, from the Cleveland Clinic, scientists know of at least 100 neurotransmitters and suspect there are many others that have yet to be discovered. And again, they're grouped based on their chemical nature. Some are better known categories of neurotransmitters, and examples of their functions include. Okay, so if they're made of amino acids, which are the bases of protein, so in other words, protein-based neurotransmitters, like glutamate, which is the most common excitatory neurotransmitter of the nervous system. It's the most abundant neurotransmitter in our brain. So I'm not going to read the rest of that. I'm just going to mention them. GABA, or which is the gamma, and most of the time you just see the gamma symbol. You don't even see the word gamma. Aminobutyric acid. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Very important for regulating brain activity. You may have heard of the medicine gabapentin, which is used to calm nerves. It's essentially a medicine designed to affect this neurotransmitter. And then glycine, very common inhibitory neurotransmitter of the spinal cord. Monoamines are single rather than amino acid style. They're single protein neurotransmitters. Serotonin is a great it's a very calm mood passivity type hormone. It's important for sleep. I know that for sure. you can see sleep patterns, mood. It's a good mood. If you've got serotonin, you're good mood, you know. So what happens with people that have deficiencies or issues with it, you can see things like seasonal affective disorder, severe anxiety or depression, even fibromyalgia, because I mean, this is designed to help improve sleep, help improve levels of anxiety so you're not worried, help keep mood nice and serene. So it's a very, you hear a lot of it, and that's why I'm talking about it, because that SSRI, you saw it was a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Well, that means, there they are, SSRIs right there. There it is. And then you have the norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, which would keep norepinephrine from being essentially recycled quickly. Again, if you don't let it recycle quickly, it has to be made further along the nerve at the cell body and then brought there. So it's going to be a slower ability to use those. And when there's some kind of imbalance where those are the neurotransmitters affected to be associated with the imbalance, then the medication would be essentially changing the role at which those neurotransmitters can work. Histamines, even though they're released all over the body, are also released in the as neurotransmitters in the cleft. Dopamine, you know, your brain loves dopamine. I'll just say it that way. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter of addiction. When you like something and you get pleasure and thrill from it, dopamine is the thing that your brain goes, oh yeah. And so people really strive to get more and more of that. You know, adrenaline can trigger dopamine release, chemicals, food, and we all know how those types of things can be effective. So the chat says, seeing histamine here makes sense now why you get sleepy when you take, yes, that's a good point. Epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, is made by the adrenal gland, but we also make it within our neurons, and then they're released into the synaptic cleft. So it's called a neurotransmitter as epinephrine, norepinephrine, or adrenaline when it's in the gap in the synaptic cleft, but it's called a hormone when it's in the bloodstream. All right. Hormones and neurotransmitters can be identical in chemical structure. They're just called hormones in one place. They're called neurotransmitters if they're in the synaptic cleft. All right. Peptide neurotransmitters, also called neuropeptides. There's a lot of these things. They're very specific chains of proteins that make it, and acetylcholine are the endorphins, which we use for pain release. Those are pain. It's a pain reliever. Your natural, it's the same chemical as morphine. These are your natural morphines, if you will. Acetylcholine, the biggest thing I want to tell you about acetylcholine, especially on the massage therapy side of things, is acetylcholine is what we use for muscle contraction. Many more things for acetylcholine in the body, but muscle contraction is absolutely vital to understanding of this neurotransmitter as it relates to muscle, because many of the muscle conditions that you see have something to do with, many times, with the nerve involvement of the muscle and acetylcholine levels. So again, I mentioned that there's low levels of acetylcholine with people with Alzheimer's, but notice that if myasthenia gravis, that's also low levels of acetylcholine. All right. Why would a neurotransmitter not work as well? Well, several things can go haywire as far as something. So too much or not enough can be released. The receptors aren't working right. The receptors aren't taking up enough. Neurotransmitters aren't reabsorbing. The reuptake's failing. Maybe the enzymes are the problem. So, and let's just give you a few examples of like things that we're seeing with Alzheimer's, with autism. Yeah. How do medications affect neurotransmitters? All right. So I'm not going to go any more here because that's just the end of it. But again, this is, you had asked about the SSRIs. So here it is. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are a type of drug class that blocks serotonin from being received and absorbed by a nerve cell. These drugs may be helpful in treating depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. So great question as it was asked earlier. I hope this helps understand neurotransmitters a little bit better. If you want to reread this one is from Cleveland Clinic. And it was nice and concise and to the point, and that's why I picked it for our discussion today. Cleveland Clinic. Thank you for that. So in the chat, you'll find the the link to it if you want to click it and go directly to this article. Okay, so I told you I wanted to show you the video of what all this was as far as the synapse. So let's do that and see some video of the synapse. Oops, there we go. So neuron synapse. And again, I told you that this one here was the synapse, so that's the one I want to show you.
Along the cell's membrane, along the axon to the terminus, where synapses are formed. The nervous system is composed of billions of communicating cells called neurons. Neurons conduct electrical signals or action potentials along the cell's membrane, along the axon to the terminus, where synapses are formed. The synapse consists of the membrane of the presynaptic cell, a synaptic cleft, and the postsynaptic cell membrane. Since an action potential can only propagate along the neuron's membrane, a chemical known as a neurotransmitter must bridge the gap between the adjacent cells. The presynaptic cell releases the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, where they will move to bind the receptor proteins in the postsynaptic cell membrane. When the action potential arrives at the synapse, it opens voltage-gated calcium channels, resulting in an inward flow of calcium. The calcium binds to the vesicular membrane. This binding activates the vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane. As fusion occurs, neurotransmitter molecules are released into the synaptic cleft. Once in the cleft, the neurotransmitter molecules diffuse throughout the interstitial fluid in the cleft. Some of the neurotransmitters will cross the synaptic cleft and bind with receptors in the postsynaptic membrane. This binding produces an effect in the postsynaptic cell by opening the protein channels and allowing the flow of ions into and out of the cell. If the effect of the neurotransmitter excites the postsynaptic membrane, an excitatory postsynaptic membrane potential, also known as EPSP, is generated. This localized depolarizing signal generally causes long-distance signals, action potentials, in the dendrite of the postsynaptic cell. If the effect of the neurotransmitter inhibits the postsynaptic membrane and inhibitory postsynaptic membrane potential, also known as an IPSP, is generated. This localized hyperpolarizing signal generally prevents the formation of long-distance signals in the postsynaptic cell. Neurotransmitters influence the postsynaptic membrane electrical state for only a short time and are removed from the synaptic cleft in one of three ways: diffusion away from the receptors, enzymatically degraded, or recycled by the presynaptic cell. Some of the neurotransmitter molecules diffuse out of reach of the neurotransmitter receptors. Some neurotransmitter molecules are removed by enzymatic degradation. Some neurotransmitter molecules are transported back into the presynaptic cell by neurotransmitter transporter proteins, where they are recycled. An example of a specific neurotransmitter that functions in these ways is serotonin. Some serotonin will cross the synaptic cleft and bind with the specific serotonin receptors within the membrane of the postsynaptic cell, producing an effect in the target cell. Serotonin will eventually unbind from the receptors and either diffuse out of the synaptic cleft and be lost, or be captured by the serotonin reuptake transporter in the presynaptic membrane. This protein complex will transport the biologically active serotonin back into the presynaptic neuron for repackaging and re-release. Acetylcholine, the first neurotransmitter discovered, also diffuses across the synaptic cleft and temporarily binds with its specific membrane-bound receptor on the postsynaptic cell, affecting the cell's electrical state. Some acetylcholine in the cleft will interact with the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which will hydrolyze the acetylcholine molecule into acetate and choline. Acetate diffuses away, but choline interacts with the presynaptic membrane-bound transporter to be recycled in the presynaptic neuron into new acetylcholine. Unlike serotonin, which is intact and biologically active following its uptake into the presynaptic cell, new synthesis of acetylcholine is necessary, with the recycled choline as the precursor.
That is what it looks like in a synapse. So that was an explanation. Let's take a look at what it looks like with just, chemicals without any explanation. Here's another one.
When an action potential reaches the synaptic terminal of the axon, it encounters a region called a synapse where two neurons come close together but do not touch one another. A minuscule gap, called the synaptic cleft, separates the synaptic terminal of the first or presynaptic neuron from the dendrite or cell body of the second or postsynaptic neuron. The arrival of an action potential at the synaptic terminal causes the synaptic terminal to become positively charged and release neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters diffuse rapidly across the synaptic cleft and bind to receptors in the membrane of the dendrites or cell body of the postsynaptic cell. Each type of receptor in the postsynaptic membrane binds to a specific type of neurotransmitter, and after binding to a neurotransmitter, the receptor causes specific types of ion channels in the postsynaptic membrane to open. As ion channels are opened, ions flow across the cell membrane of the postsynaptic neuron along their concentration gradients. This flow of ions into the postsynaptic neuron causes a postsynaptic potential in the dendrites or cell body. Depending on the channels open and the ions that flow in, synaptic potentials can be either excitatory, making a neuron less negative inside and more likely to fire an action potential, or inhibitory, making it more negative and less likely to fire. An excitatory postsynaptic potential is called an EPSP. An inhibitory postsynaptic potential is called an IPSP. A synapse that produces EPSPs in the postsynaptic cell is called an excitatory synapse, while a synapse producing IPSPs is an inhibitory synapse. Postsynaptic potentials cannot travel far in a neuron. After a few millimeters at most, the ions leak back across the membrane and the signal is lost. However, postsynaptic potentials travel far enough to reach the cell body, where they determine whether or not an action potential will be produced.
All right. So let me stop the share. That is the story of how neurons work, whether it's the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. When neurons connect to their receiving cells, whether it's another neuron, whether it's a muscle cell, gland cell, whatever it is, that is what's happening at the chemical level. Now, again, the electrical impulse is about speed. The communication is about chemical. It works very well when it works well. Okay, the pathologies are the result of when it's not working so well. So when I see you again on Tuesday, we will get to the good stuff. We get to talk about the brain. We get to talk about the parts of the brain and how the brain functions. We're out of the microscopic world and looking at the more macroscopic structures. If there are any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, we are done for the evening. In about a half hour or so, look for tonight's recording if you want to rewatch any part. And whatever else I can attach to it notes-wise, we'll certainly do that. All right. Everyone have a great night. The notes, great. The notes will be attached also. Thanks, Ina. Appreciate that. All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your Sunday evening. See you Tuesday at 3 p.m. Bye-bye.